Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining with us today. We're just going to wait another moment to wait for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TBR webinar series. Today, Senior Analysts Boz Ristov, Anelita Baklova, and Kelly Laziska will be discussing India-centric vendors defy gravity and all sensible expectations. On the deck, you'll see that Patrick Heffernan was supposed to be presenting today, but unfortunately, he's meeting with some clients today, so he won't be on the webinar, just as an FYI. But before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in ON24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here is Alitza to begin the webinar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. Let me start by just giving a brief summary of what we'll cover today. Our discussion today will focus specifically on the IT services market. We cover it in our IT services benchmark, which publishes every quarter. It's a very dynamic market, very broad and big. Specifically for this webinar, we cover 29 vendors in our benchmark report. So all the assessments and analysis will be focused around those 29 vendors in the report. We see a lot of new trends in the IT services market. We see new areas that are emerging for growth. And we track those vendors on a quarterly basis. So it will be our assessment of the vendor's performance and strategies. For this webinar, we will provide an update on the latest IT services benchmark, which published last week. And we plan to take you through the slides for the first 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So we have identified 4 topics to discuss today. Number 1 is we'll provide you with an overview of the IT services market, and we'll provide some predictions on where we see the market heading in the coming quarters. Number 2 is we'll look into which vendors are transforming faster to address demand and are generating better results versus their peers. Number 3, we'll dive deeper into the performance of the India-centric IT services providers, and we'll discuss how they compare to the rest of the IT services vendors in the benchmark. And the last topic, number 4, is we'll stay focused on the India-centric vendors, and we'll examine which ones have the most to lose from sustained success. On the next slide, I'll start with the first topic around market overview and predictions. So this graph shows you the trailing 12 months IT services revenue growth for the 29 vendors in the benchmark. And we see a trend over the past 4 or 5 quarters of revenue deceleration. It's still positive in 2Q19. Trailing 12-month revenue for the vendors was 1.9% year to year. But when you compare it to the year-ago quarter, growth was around 8% in Q18. So there has been a change in the numbers. And there have been various challenges that vendors are experiencing and changes in the trends that lead this deceleration. For example, we still see a number of vendors experiencing hurdles in traditional IT services areas due to commoditization. We see an increasing competitive pressures from incumbent IT services providers, so all the vendors that we cover in our IT services benchmark. I'm sorry, can you see the slides? I see a note that someone is not seeing the slides.
If you are having problems seeing the slides, try refreshing the web page, and that should update it.
Okay. So, there's still competitive challenges from the vendors that are in the IT services space, but there's also new entrants in the marketplace, and Amazon Web Services is certainly one example as a company that's been developing its IT services mix and offering competitive solutions to clients. So vendors are now being even more compelled to drive differentiation in their portfolios. And I think this is really particularly true around the areas of around advising and implementing and managing next generation solutions, such as transformational engagements around digital and cloud. So in addition to competition, vendors have tried to change their portfolio and expand into new areas. That are newer than the ones that they have been pushing out. So, digital and cloud and cybersecurity, for example, are very common now, and a common topic across the vendors. So now we see vendors going into newer areas, which could be blockchain, edge computing, quantum computing. So, there's a push, not from all the vendors yet, but for an increasing number of vendors such as IBM, Accenture, Apple, for example, going into those segments. But there's still the challenges around competition, the challenges around commoditization in the traditional IT services space, cannibalization by clouds in infrastructure services, and also increasing political and economic uncertainty is still preventing vendors to ramp up their growth in the next quarter and in 4Q19. So we don't really expect significant shifts in the trend in terms of growth for our IT services peers here that we cover in the benchmark. And we expect this growth to be in the low single digits for 2019. On the next slide, we see that I just want to touch upon a few service lines that we cover in the report. So consulting and systems integration, our largest service line in the report in terms of revenue share, continue to outperform in growth the rest of the service lines. And this is because vendors have been pushing to drive transformations using their advisory expertise, using their implementation capabilities around transforming clients' business and IT models through next generation technology. So this has been a very positive development in the consulting and systems integration line. And this trend of growth will remain through 2019 because vendors will be scaling their activities with clients. Clients are now beyond the proof of concept, beyond the initial advisory and education, and expanding well into larger transformational opportunities, moving their broader applications portfolios or infrastructures to the cloud, for example. So they need the advisory and the systems integration capabilities from the vendors to continue to scale their transformations. Applications outsourcing and BPO are also showing positive growth, and this trend will remain through the end of 2019. Applications outsourcing, we've seen a lot of workload migration to hosted platforms. There's also maintenance opportunities that drive growth in the segment. We also see vendors moving and adding additional offerings around customer experience solutions that add more value and that add more activities in application engagements. So they're now working more with new buyers, such as client CMOs. BPO, while when you look from a vendor perspective, when you look at their portfolios, they cover many of the traditional BPO offerings, such as procurement, human resources, outsourcing, and finance and accounting. Some of the vendors are diversifying their portfolios and adding industry specialized solutions, adding analytics-driven offerings, or even expanding into new areas such as marketing support services. And Accenture is really one good example of a company that's expanding in a segment. So we expect to see more developments around on the portfolio side in terms of diversifying BPO revenue streams to accelerate growth in the segment. And the last service line, IT outsourcing, it's been declining for a while now. I don't think this trend will improve and will change through the end of the year because of the challenges vendors are experienced by commoditization, by cannibalization from cloud. They've been exiting some lower value content, and IBM is one good example of that. Some are revisiting unprofitable traditional infrastructure services deals, so they're losing revenue on that end, and this transformation will still continue, and I don't expect the red arrow to reverse in the next 2 quarters. The last comment that I want to make about the market overview is on this slide. We look at IT services segment, and most of the services peers within the benchmark are really delivering services. So in order to provide this solutions that are driven by technology and combined with services and drive the business outcome for clients, they need to get the technology expertise from somewhere, and this is why we've seen an increased interest and increased importance for IT services vendors to partner with technology vendors. So it is really important for IT services firms, and they not only partner with one company, but they partner with a broad ecosystem of technology providers, of academia organizations, or industry organizations, research and development organizations, and startups. They also partner with their clients to jointly, as a group, develop solutions. So partnership models are really in fashion, and they're really important for IT services vendors. The joint go-to-market approach with technology companies will continue to increase in importance going forward, but I think there's going to be one change, and we're kind of seeing it already in terms of the relationships amongst partners. So while before many of the vendors said that they're very technology agnostic, that and they kind of advertised it. Now it seems that vendors are becoming more specialized. They are building deeper relationships with technology vendors to combine technology with services, and kind of becoming experts around partner solutions. So it seems like vendors will be becoming less agnostic, more specialized experts around a specific solution, and they're letting their clients know about it, and it's becoming part of their value proposition. On this slide, I want to kind of turn it over to Kelly. She will start talking about our next trend to explain which of the vendors are performing faster and generating better results than the others.
Thanks, Elitza. So on this slide, we ranked the top 10 benchmarked vendors, excuse me, in terms of 2Q19 revenue performance, and we tracked the rankings. So the chart on the right calls out the vendors' revenue contribution, the top 10 vendors, and then on the left we had a chart that called out more notable shifts in the revenue leaders, as well as the ones that maintain their positions well, which is a key indicator of their success in driving adoption of emerging technologies. As vendors transform their legacy offerings to embrace emerging technologies, including security, digital analytics, and IoT, I think talent's going to be a differentiator for some of the vendors in the sense that they'll be able to better increase adoption among clients of new portfolio offerings, as well as drive business value for their clients, leading to increased revenue expansion. During the quarter, Accenture was able to overtake IBM for the number one position in terms of revenue size among the 29 vendors in the IT services space that we cover. This is something that TBR anticipated would happen towards the end of 2019, but Accenture outperformed its closest competitor sooner than expected. Accenture has been building out horizontal and platform-based capabilities through acquisitions, as well as by opening industry centers and innovation hubs that appeal to new buyers. Managing their talent will be a key element of their success. Compared to other peers in the IT services space, Accenture has quite a large talent base to manage, which could make or break their working. IBM has been decreasing their talent. They've been shedding resources to streamline operations, as well as leverage a more flexible delivery model, which is increasing pressures with recruiting, managing, and retaining talent, which is causing the company to fall further behind Accenture in terms of market share. Moving on to the next one, TCS and DXC displaced Fujitsu and NTT Data on the revenue, their positions in the revenue space. TCS highlights the successful alignment of its service delivery frameworks with the needs of its global client base. That's allowing it to better deliver services to its existing clients, as well as move beyond its traditional base. Digital-based engagements are increasing as a share of TCS's revenue base and backlog, and TCS claims nearly 1/3 of its revenues are digital-related, which is also contributing to their top-line growth, despite ongoing market-wide pressures within their legacy services business. Effective use of their digital services is helping them create those larger outsourcing engagements within its traditional services base and kind of avoid the declines in legacy areas that some of its peers are facing. Fujitsu and NTT Data are still investing in their delivery and innovation locations outside Japan to help increase the recognition in underpenetrated areas. But despite these investments, both companies are losing market share to their peers and remain challenged by their less established client reach and talent bases outside their core geography, which is creating obstacles to revenue growth, as well as causing revenue size to drop down for the two of them. Fujitsu has maintained relatively flat growth over the past year. To create better flexibility and to fine-tune their go-to-market strategy, Fujitsu has been changing their resource organization, so to say. They reduced sales staff and operations in their North America and European businesses. However, this is more or less hindering the company's ability to accelerate adoption of their new portfolio offerings and more or less monetize their investments in digital, cloud, and software in the short term, which is resulting in their flat revenue performance. NTT Data's previous inorganic contributions over the past 2 years and are helping them to ensue upselling opportunities, which is helping them to combat pricing pressures and commoditization within the traditional services. But these investments have not really been enough to offset the declines, the overall declines within their legacy business, as the company continues to lose market share compared to its peers. Capgemini and Cisco retained their positions of number 9 and 10 respectively, and we expect that this ranking will stand in 3Q19. Offering industry expertise enables Capgemini to address clients' business-specific challenges, while software and subscription-based services drive opportunities for Cisco. Cisco's shift to embrace software-driven services through acquisitions and expanded partnerships with technology vendors is helping the firm to maintain its position in the space. Its partnerships with technology vendors helps to generate an increase in migration and managed services engagements, particularly around hybrid IT and multi-cloud, which is leading to an increase in subscription-based revenue streams for the company, as well as helping them to scale solutions and gain access to a greater client base. So moving on to the next slide. On this slide, we showed the changes in revenue growth among the top 10 vendors. 8 of the top 10 trailing 12-month revenue leaders experienced decelerating year-to-year revenue growth in U.S. dollars during the quarter, except for IBM and Fujitsu. While their revenue growth didn't decelerate, they're not growing in leaps and bounds as their large legacy base is weighing down overall revenue expansion. While IBM Services revenue growth accelerated, the metric remained negative in 2Q19. Delivering higher value and higher margin services that integrate technology and industry expertise, as well as support clients' digital reinventions, will enable IBM Services to return to revenue growth in the second half of 2019. While Fujitsu maintains its leading market share in Japan, the heavy reliance on the region for revenue generation is not going to sustain the company's long-term revenue goals, as vendors are increasing investments in software and technology-led solutions, as well as building up their presence in APAC, particularly Japan. Fujitsu will need to move much quicker to secure its existing market share, as well as execute in expanding in other regions. Vendors have also been looking to increase, or have been increasing their acquisition activity to help boost revenue growth by including new capabilities, as well as integrating industry expertise. So a few examples of the industry acquisitions. Cognizant announced its intent to acquire Zenith Technologies, which is a digital solutions specialist in the healthcare and life sciences segment. And Capgemini also announced the planned acquisitions of Altran in the industrial sector, and then Connexus Consulting Group, which helps in the energy and utility space. While acquisitions are helping some of the vendors to quickly transition their portfolio, as well as provide a larger client base, it's not helping all of them. For example, DXC, it's maintained an active acquisition space, but it's maintained an active acquisition strategy to help fill its portfolio gaps, as well as integrate digital staff within its talent bench, but the company has not been successful in leveraging these assets to sustain growth, resulting in a large revenue growth deceleration. Additionally, the drastic change in DXC's revenue growth was one of the main reasons for the overall IT services revenue growth to decelerate. And with that, I'll hand it over to Elisa to move on to our third topic.
Thank you, Kelly. So our third topic is about performance of the India-centric IT services providers and how they compare to the rest of the IT services vendors. So on this slide, and on this graph, we plotted all the 29 vendors that we track in the benchmark based on their trailing 12-month revenue growth and based on their profitability. So if you take a closer look on this graph, we clearly see the leadership of the India-centric companies such as Genpact, HCL, TCS, Infosys, and Cognizant to some extent in terms of revenue growth compared to the rest of the vendors. They're positioned on the right-hand side of this graph. They also continue to outperform peers for the most part in operating margin, and this trend has been present for many quarters now, even though in overall operating margin for the India-centric vendors has decreased slightly. They're still outperforming the multinational vendors and the Europe-based competitors. Accenture is the larger vendor, larger bubble, so this represents the total revenue. And it's still, a growth leader despite its a larger revenue size when you compare it to the performance of IBM Services, which is on the left side on the slow growth companies. It's a very positive development. I think Accenture is one of the companies that has been kind of, its position on this graph hasn't changed significantly. It's been in that quadrant for a long time now, and all the efforts to enhance its value proposition around industry and functional expertise, and lately around platform-based services is really paying off for the company. Atos and Capgemini, Europe-based companies, they have moved a little bit closer to the center of the graph and closer to the revenue growth average when I compare them to the past 2 or 3 quarters. But those two companies are really making notable progress in terms of changing their portfolios around digital and cloud and cybersecurity, implementing and transforming business models through next generation technologies, and also making, very targeted acquisitions to expand market reach in North America, because they are Europe-driven companies, but North America for both companies has become a region of strategic importance and expansion. On the left side, IBM Services, T-Systems, DXC Technology, those are examples of companies that are still in transformation mode. They're changing their organizations and portfolios. They're exiting unprofitable contracts. They're decreasing headcount, you name it, but they're still not able to overcome challenges and peer pressure. And some of their key competitors are taking share. And Accenture is one good example with IBM, which IBM was #1 until last quarter in terms of revenue size, but now we have Accenture with the largest revenue in the benchmark. I want to let Boz also chime in here on this slide to provide us some more details on the India-centric companies. Boz?
Sure, thank you, Alita. As we kind of been going through the slides, it's always kind of to see how some of the the vendors that have placed certain bets early enough are gaining traction. The India-centric vendors are an example. Some of them that have been doubling down on what they do well, which is really pulling the labor arbitrage model successfully. Still, although automation is crippling up and it's a lot of opportunities are provided as a result of automation, the adoption of automated based solutions, including RPA or anything around AI or intelligent automation, any buzzword you want to add into it, it's then very nascent stage in terms of a buyer's adoption. But at the same time, buyers are still price cautious about the services and the particular services that they're looking to purchase. Could be from application services portfolio, from business process services, and so forth, that allows them to drive more cost-efficient operations. We see some of the India-centric vendors embedding automation in service delivery as a way to entice and sweeten up some of the contracts and the value proposition. But the grand scale, we see also a resurgence in some of the larger outsourcing contracts, especially the lengthy one that still generate a bulk of their revenue, especially seeing some of the repeat business still pretty strong overall. And it's about kind of continuing that stickiness for them, as well as trying to drive market share and expanding quality share of the existing client base. With that said, the human element is as much as it's important. I think Kelly mentioned earlier about Accenture's some of the headwinds that it could face, considering the almost 500,000 people organization, is the attrition. And not that Accenture or in-Accenture vendors are immune to any of those trends. It's something. It's just the nature of the business. It's nature of the what that we see right now in the market. In certain markets, it's improving macroeconomic conditions, increasing in wages. Skill shortages is another piece of the puzzle that's it's enabling staff, especially the 3 to 5 year staff, to jump and change badges between employers, which kind of drives some of the attrition trends within the industry. We also see some layoffs in certain, some vendors trying to offset some of the non-profitable units, which, it's a trend that the in-Accenture vendors, as much as they rely right now on that low cost leverage and the human element, is potentially, again, they should be wary of, and it's as they're trying to close the gap in terms of a revenue size to their Western counterparts. So a lot of the trends probably resonate with a lot of you folks on the line today, and with something we see kind of ebbs and flows and some of the anticipation of automation kicking in, but we see kind of like trying to. It's like a bigger wave right now. As I'm actually speaking off from RPA conference right now, just that I'm as we speak, and we see a lot of those trends. That we've seen the vendors and also from the software side of the community as well. That anticipation of impact of automation and how the human plus machines, will go forward. So certainly a lot to look for. We have a couple more slides to dive deeper into the India-centric vendors' performance, as well as how it relates to their management consulting counterparts and the broader digital transformation services counterparts, and how those models will evolve. But we wanted to take a quick poll questions and kind of get a sense check from the folks on the line. If we can just move on to the next slide and see where. What do you guys think? What are the biggest challenges that the India-centric vendors will face in the near term? I just wanted to kind of see if any of you folks think similar direction, or are we missing something from our research that we should be looking after? So we have pricing pressures, selling new offerings, and recruiting and retaining talent. And should probably left a few for other, so people can chime in separately, but we can take those as a follow-up if need be. Give it a moment to see folks to submit their answers. All right. Okay, we'll go into the poll results. So it's somewhat surprising. Nobody responded to selling new offerings. So as the biggest challenge, it's certainly not the biggest challenge. Pricing pressure is ranking the second, and then the biggest challenge, recruiting and retaining talent. I would say I would agree to an extent to the recruiting and retaining talent, just because of the way their business model is. But I have to say that the selling new offerings may probably surprise you, some of them, because we've seen some of them trying to act like software-like company, or trying to establish the KPIs that are necessary, try to establish separate units that can sell products and platforms. Yeah, they are doing okay growth-wise, but they're from a very, very small base. They're not more than 3 to 5% of the overall services revenue, of the total revenue for those companies. So if we are moving to a services economy and a services business model for the organizations, I think they are going to have to start thinking a little bit more strategically how to package and sell those solutions, either in a license-based model or more aggressively as a service model. But in the short term, I have to, the recruiting and retaining talent is certainly something that, like I said earlier, it's not something that anyone is immune to, but I think long term, from a business model sustainability, selling new offerings, should be something that they'll consider. But maybe something that we can look into the next phase of the conversation is maybe they can partner better and to try to sell those new offerings. So kind of going to the last section of the presentation today is some excerpts from our digital transformation services research. Elitza and Kelly have been diving deeper into the performance of the IT services vendors. We wanted to kind of branch in a little bit into the digital space. And I know it's a buzzword. It's been going around for the last few years now, and everyone defines digital differently. On the graph here, we have plotted just a number of vendors that we look through the lens of our digital transformation insights research. And we have identified a group of vendors by groups based on their capabilities, based on their business models, based on how we see those business models evolve. And the latest research we published was focused, and we were cross-vendor comparison research between the India-centric vendors as well as the management consultancies. So when I say management consultancies, we include McKinsey, BCG, Bain, as well as the Big Four. So kind of looking at a group of 7 vendors and a group of 5 vendors that we track within the IT services benchmark from India-centric side, including TCS, Cognizant, Infosys, Wipro, and HCL. So it was an interesting comparison to start to see how those vendors are actually adopting their business models and reacting to buyers' requirements for new opportunities. What we discovered as part of that kind of a contrast and compare research that we published in September was that a lot of times vendors kind of fool themselves and think about they can do it all on their own. And they position their value proposition as we're an end-to-end provider. And in reality, no vendor can do it all. And I think Elitza hinted earlier about some of the changes we're looking into the partnership model. And I think it's a trend that we're starting to go deeper into and to see who's actually going to establish better partnership and how those vendors will be able to collaborate better. Because, yes, a lot of the vendors, including India-centric and the management consulting vendors, are going typically after brownfield opportunities. So it's kind of like existing client base trying to expand, their wallet share. But in some cases, there are greenfield opportunities stemming from buyers that are really interested in transforming from soup to nuts, a complete organization. And that's where it's really necessary to have that partnership model well established. We see that in the long term, the partnerships will evolve, as in the current form, the technology diminishes essentially differentiation between all the parties. With the new federated-like partnership model, there'll likely be new siloed models, which essentially there's expectations for open data standards and data interoperability, especially amplified through blockchain, to diminish those two new silos. But from a business model perspective, for the India-centric vendors and for the management consultancies, we see those groups of vendors actually starting to partner a little bit closer, a little bit better. In some cases, they may be seen as frenemies, healthy competition, essentially. But we see those business models complementing. And, someone say, well, TCS is too big to partner with Deloitte. Yes, there's some cases like this, but certainly TCS capabilities and maybe Bain management consulting, there's a good complement in terms of or BCG in that matter, technology acumen from the BCG perspective and a scale that TCS may provide. So there's arguments on each side, but from a business model perspective and how those groups, as we look at that chart, maybe starting to getting a little bit closer. The management consultants is coming down and the India-centric vendors moving up the stack in terms of the go-to-market performance. And the next slide is really about that digital portion, and kind of like we took a step back, and these are kind of the numbers that we track across the 12 vendors that I mentioned, the Big Four, the McKinsey, BCG, and Bain, as well as the India-centric vendors, total services revenues. And we have identified 4 areas of digital in terms of how we model based on TBR's definitions. Not saying that there's certain gaps here, as you guys can see, This is just based on our current coverage of where we track those companies, but it's more for illustrative purposes to tell the story around who defines digital how, and really who generates, who earns the most from digital, and how much essentially the service lines vary. I think Kelly and Lisa talked about some of the India-centric vendors generating about a third of the revenue. And we've seen that trend kind of going from a third all the way to 60% of the revenue for the various vendors. We see the India-centric vendors being more on that 30% portion of the business coming from digital-related activities. At the same time, though, the management consultancies, we see them split in more of two camps. The Big Four, they're a little bit more aggressive, and then the McKinsey, BCG, and Bain they are strong enough in what they do in terms of consultancies, but they're not going too far down in the weeds into some of the service lines like application management and business process support in that matter. The natural India-centric vendors approach, they approach the digital transformation opportunities bottom up. They're relying heavily on their legacy relationship with the IT buyer, and they're really executing on the services supply side. I mean, all the HCL generates about 29.7%, Infosys about 35%, looking at how their percentages split into 2Q19. But a lot of those are focused on those IT transformations. Some of them have started putting investments into the front office, but as it relates to some of the back office, like the analytics areas and cloud, the proportions are much more. Take an example, TCS. We estimate that they generate about $400 million in digital marketing services, mostly grown organically, but in comparison, the analytics services are close to $3 billion in terms of how we define analytics and insights. I know TCS have started making some investments in inorganic investments last year, but again, it's an area that they want to make sure they have presence, but it's not where they generate the bulk of their revenue. At the same time, they have a really strong base of data scientists that helps them to generate a lot of the analytics and insights revenues. On the contrary side, both the Big Four and the MBB group, they refrain from actually spelling out how much digital revenue they generate, which was kind of attributed partially because of their business model. They're quiet companies. They don't have to report those financials. But also, we believe it's just a way they fold a lot of their digital, quote-unquote, digital capabilities under their consulting first approach and business-first approach. We're not discounting the consultancy's efforts to drum up non-consulting business, but again, we do believe that they blend the strategy prowess with execution chops, and with the former remains the dominant performer. I think out of the big the consultancies, we see Deloitte probably having the most diversified revenue across digital-related revenues. We can see them across all the four digital-related service lines and their performance and how they are positioning. PwC and EY are not far behind from Deloitte in terms of revenue in these areas as well. But we think that those two firms are still maintaining the status quo with the consulting first technology second approach, despite their attempts to morph into a software-like companies in some instances. We actually see vendors like, EY and PwC trying to put some more efforts into the managed services space, and even a front office managed services space like front office BPO for tax and compliance, financial crime types of service areas, which are very much a CFO-like funded services. So a lot of push and pull between those two groups of vendors. Again, the India-centric rely on their, I think both sets of vendors rely on their legacy relationships with the C-suite or the IT buyer. The big change we've seen overall in the space is the IT buyer is stepping into, again, back in the driver's seat, essentially, as a purchaser, as a key decision maker. The business leaders are important, but when it comes to the big white enterprise transformation, IT must be involved, because we're talking about complex re-architecture right now. and business leaders don't want to be the one taking the risk and saying, yes, we are ready to execute on automation, transformation, or AI implementation when they don't know actually the architecture behind. That's why it's important to have the IT involved, and that's where the Indian-centric vendors relationship with those buyers is key, but there's certainly a relationship with the C-suite that the management consultancies bring to bear as they try to go downstream into the managed services space. So again, those numbers were for illustrative purposes coming from our digital transformation insights. Certainly happy to share the definitions after the webinar today. We just wanted to kind of highlight some of the changes and maybe some of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead of both sets of vendors. And then kind of wrap up the presentation today with topics that, we're looking after. We'll be publishing our 2020 predictions fairly soon before the end of the year. We hinted at a couple of the topics, like especially around the changing model of the alliance partnerships and vendors departing from the technology agnosticism, which will likely require a little bit more concentrated messaging and a more specific messaging around who's partnering with who is ready to go to market with who. We know about the innovation centers and design studios and whatnot. Everybody wants to be friends with everybody, but at the end of the day, buyers are expecting very pointed solutions, and which we think that would drive some of those relationship evolve to be a little more strategic when it comes to SIs and technology vendors. But the other trend that we will start keeping a close eye on, we observed that over the last 6 to 9 months, a number of leading IT services vendors have made changes at the helm. I mean, Cognizant got a new CEO, EY got a new CEO, Accenture got a new CEO, DXC got a new CEO. We know Capgemini is getting a new CEO with the next spring. SAP just last week, got 2 new CEOs, essentially. So the big questions for us that we're going to look forward to is new decade, 2020 is kicking out a new decade, new CEOs, and really, will there be any new ideas? And that's where we're kind of trying to identify and see the background plus existing performance plus where the market is heading. We have some early bets that we're going to spell out, in our predictions document of where we think some of those, the course of the CEOs will play a role in those organizations I mentioned and overall to the market performance. But I think the common denominator across all of them will be to, it's probably not a surprise to most of you, is really going more into the platform-based economy and trying to be oriented into that technology-first mindset for most of the organizations. And, everyone will still try to rely on core capabilities plus any kind of inorganic add-ons that they've gained recently from the recent purchases. But I think there's a lot to look for, because number of new CEOs, new decade, and we'll find out what the new ideas will be, but certainly something we'll be tracking closely as our research advances. With that, I'll turn it back over to Elita for wrapping up the presentation, open up for Q&A.
Thank you, Boz. This is just to give you a summary of our IT services benchmark coverage. It's one of our larger publications that includes 29 vendors. You see what type of deliverables we have. Maybe some of you subscribe to it as well. 29 vendors across several, a long list, I would say, metrics, 4 segments and 3 geographies. This is something that we publish on a quarterly basis, and we're happy to provide more insights offline or as part of other special reports or research engagement. So feel free to touch base with us and ask us questions after this webinar. So I want to open it up for questions. There are several questions that are queued here on our end. And the first question is, which company is positioning as a leadership in innovation and not just focusing on cost arbitrage? I can start, and maybe Boz and Kelly can chime in here. It really depends what companies we're looking at, but from a broader IT services space, I would say that most of the companies that we're seeing that are growing are positioning for their clients as driving innovation. IBM is a really good example about a company that's been investing in developing both new technologies and tying in services, using its research and development expertise and capabilities to develop new solutions and to drive innovation for clients in terms of changing their business models, in terms of collaboration together with the client, with a partner ecosystem, to expand into new areas such as blockchain, such as IoT. So, you know, I don't see the cost arbitrage being advertised as much by the larger companies, such as Accenture or Capgemini or IBM, Atos as well. Most of those vendors are really pushing messaging around creating new solutions and how they affect the business and how they drive outcomes for clients. So yes, certainly there is a cost arbitrage into the mix. There's also automation in the mix. It's really an important part of the equation. But I think the part around change in the models and adding new solutions is a driver for at least for the larger vendors. Bob, would you like to add anything here?
No, I think you cover it. I mean, I think everyone is trying to differentiate in some way, shape, or form, and it's hard to differentiate, as we mentioned earlier, about technology is to an extent diminishing differentiation. I think it's about packaging and pricing, and really about transparency around service offerings. I think long term, we'll start seeing, of vendors starting adding digital routes to selling offerings. But I think there's going to be the question of, consumption models on the buyer side and readiness, and if buyers are ready to consume all this new innovation. I think sometimes innovation is good, but I think it's not everyone is prepared to take it all, and that's where I think it's there's some of the delay and ebbs and flows in the performance as we saw in the overall IT services market.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question for you, Bob. Can you tell us about the more compelling automation investments that you see from the India-centric firms?
Well, more compelling? That's an interesting question. Well, I think the compelling is how you measure it, and really some of the KPIs that are changing. And right now, for what we have seen in the market, vendors are primarily focused on reducing FTE's effort, which is a key KPI. And but I think the bigger question is in the test that actually those vendors are facing. It's not so much from technological innovation, because they're all smart people. They know how to. They're all engineers, and they develop smart technologies. It's about those vendors' ability actually to take advantage of the cost savings that they're able to offer to their buyers as a result of using automation, because it's very easy to go and say, Mr. and Mrs. Client, we're going to save you X amount of dollars because we're using automation, which is a great value proposition for the buyer. Say, sure, go ahead. But then what do you do with those cost savings as a buyer, and what do you do cost savings as a vendor? And that's where I think the India-centric vendors, as well as everybody else in the market, is to be able to convince the buyers to reinvest back into innovation programs and to drive a enterprise-wide transformation. That's where I think we'll see what a compelling story really stinks up, because as I mentioned earlier, the revenues from those platforms and products for those vendors is very, very small, like 2 to 3 to 5% at the most as a percentage of total revenue. So there's some KPIs that are good for internal product marketing kind of a measuring, but long-term story, I think, is looking at how they're able to take advantage of those cost savings and securing their position as the primary services vendors.
Thank you, Boz. Our next question is, do you see more consolidation trend within the IT services industry players? So if you look at the IT services space, there's been consolidation going on for many years now. We've seen larger vendors merging with smaller ones. I think for the coming years, at least for next year, it will be more about getting niche expertise and using smaller scale tuck-in acquisition to gain capabilities, to gain some niche expertise, to gain geographic reach. So, using mid-size acquisitions, so something of the likes that Atos and Capgemini have been doing in North America in the past year. So, I'm thinking that mostly it will be small to mid-size acquisitions in the space, largely to drive, for example, design consulting expertise or marketing consulting, or some expertise that's really not as broad in the IT services space, so that vendors can augment capabilities. Our next question is, where is that ITO work going if not to members of this benchmark group? Do you see a corresponding growth increase among members of your cloud benchmark? Are any of those cloud vendors benefiting differently? So yes, we do track IT services revenues, and you're right, we track revenues within cloud as well. So there are specific reports that we publish on cloud professional services, and managed cloud services is certainly part of the equation. And if you were to split out those managed cloud services, certainly there is much better performance for the vendors that we cover in the benchmark. So, for example, Accenture, Capgemini, Atos, IBM, they all have managed cloud services revenues, and they are both, all those vendors are growing and performing well in the managed cloud services space. But on the ITO side, it's a different picture, and we saw the trends, and we went over them as well. So it's kind of shifting in the mix, in the revenue mix, but managed cloud services is still not a big part of the equation. So it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really have enough power to overcome any other pressures that we're seeing in the infrastructure services side.
Elisa, if I can add to that, I can add to that a little bit as well. I think second part of the question, do you see a corresponding growth increase among members? And I think you mentioned earlier some of the vendors that were not tracking IT services benchmark, but maybe having an impact on overall growth of the market and how some of the revenues get distributed. I think you mentioned Amazon Web Services as a contender that maybe not tracking the IT services benchmark right now, but certainly captures some of that infrastructure as a service offering, as well as broadly professional services. Still a fraction, but certainly a contender to keep an eye on. The other portion of the equation is actually the distribution of some of the revenues of the traditional ITO, as we know it, to maybe some of the software managed services, as Elisa mentioned, to maybe CNSI, or maybe some of the application outsourcing areas, even to an extent even to the BPaaS layer that maybe kind of blurs between application services and a business process services. So there may be some kind of a partial redistribution of service line revenues, but those are some new contenders that are outside, like Amazon Web Services, that are capturing some of those declining ITO revenues we track in the benchmark.
Thank you, Boz. And I think we have time for one very quick question here, and then there's a long list of questions that's waiting to be answered, and we promise that we'll send you an answer via email, because we really want to make sure that all those questions in the queue are answered on our end. So the last question: what are the offerings that are hot right now? I think from management consulting and from an broader IT services side, the vendors that I track closely, they really invest and develop offerings around digital consulting. So design expertise, something that's tied to improving customer experience and user experience, on the solution side as well as on the integrating services with that, improving fan experience, for example, for tennis championships. So anything that's tied to making customers happy and offering that solution for the clients is really important. Industry specialized solutions as well. They are really hot right now. For financial services, for manufacturing, for retail. So anything specific to improving operations and improving sales cycle, again, improving customer experience and user experience. With this, I think we're going to close our webinar, and I want to let Sarah do the closing. Thank you.
All right, everyone, please reach out to the team if you have any more follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, October 30th for Separating the Tricks from the Treats in the Emerging Technology Sector. Thank you and have a great day.